Hello? Is this thing on? Okay, here goes nothing. So they got 99 and all that. You get the idea. We're gonna be reading this book. Part 1, The Problem of Nothingness. Chapter 1, The Origin of Negation. Questioning. Number 1, questioning, and then there's the first footnote. Number 1. Satra's section heading is La Interrogation, but as interrogation in English suggests a formal activity, example by the police, I translate it here as questioning. In this section, Sartre closely follows Heidegger's methodology in Being and Time. See especially Heidegger 1980, page 2. As the term question as substantive and as verb centrally figures in English translations of Heidegger, this adds the advantage of my choice. Elsewhere, I occasionally use to interrogate, especially when interrogate figures as a verb in the text. Okay, back to the thing. Our investigation has taken us into the heart of being, but it has also reached a dead end because we have not been able to establish a connection between the two regions of being we have discovered. This is probably due to choosing a perspective ill-suited to our inquiry. Descartes found himself confronting an analogous problem when he had to describe the relations between the soul and the body. He suggested that we should seek a solution in the area where, as a matter of fact, the union of thinking substance with extended substance takes place, that is, in the imagination. This is valuable advice. Of course, Descartes' concern was not the same as ours, and we do not conceive of the imagination as he did. But what we can learn is that we should not begin by separating the two terms in a relationship. In order to try to put them back together, a relation is a synthesis. It follows the result of its analysis. It follows that the results of its analysis cannot correspond to the moments of this synthesis. M. Laporte says that to abstract something is to consider it in an isolated state, when it is not made to exist in isolation. Footnote 2. Let's go look at the second footnote. Jean Laporte, 1886 to 1948, was a French philosopher and a historian of philosophy. In contrast, something concrete is a totality that can exist by itself alone. Husserl takes the same view. Redness for him is an abstraction, because color cannot exist without shape. A spatio-temporal and fully determinate thing is, on the other hand, concrete. From this point of view, consciousness is an abstraction, since it contains within it an ontological origin that reaches toward the in itself, and reciprocally, the phenomenon is also an abstraction, since it has to appear as conscious, appear to consciousness. The concrete entity can only be the synthetic totality, of which both consciousness and the phenomenon constitute mere moments. What is concrete is man in the world, with the specific union of man with the world that Heidegger, for example, names being in the world. To interrogate experience like Kant with respect to its conditions of possibility, or to perform like Husserl, a phenomenological reduction that reduces the world to the status of the noematic, which is like thinker, the person who's thinking, I think. I think that's what it means. Noema and noesis is like the thinker and the thought. For those who don't know. Status of the nomadic correlative of consciousness is to begin deliberately from an abstraction. But we will no more succeed in reconstituting the concrete out of the sum or the organization of the elements abstracted from it than we will succeed in Spinoza's system, in reaching the substance through the infinite sum of its modes. The relation of the regions of being is a primordial bursting forth, which forms the very part of the very structure of these beings. That is how we encounter it. From the moment we first inspect it, we need only open our eyes and interrogate. From a standpoint of naivete, the totality that is man in the world. The description of this totality will enable us to answer the two questions. One, what is the synthetic relation that we are calling being in the world? Two, why must man and the world be in order? What must man and the world be in order for this relation between them to be possible? In truth, each of these questions enters into the other, and we cannot hope to answer them separately. But each mode of human behavior, as the behavior of man in the world, can simultaneously deliver us, man, the world, and the relation that unites them. So long as we regard these modes of behaviors as realities to be objectively apprehended, and not as subjective affections that are able to be disclosed only to the standpoint of reflection. We will not confine ourselves to studying just one mode of behavior. On the contrary, we will try to describe several and to penetrate, pause, within each of them. The basic meaning of the man-world relation, but we ought to begin by choosing some initial mode of behavior to serve as a guiding thread in our investigation. In fact, our investigation itself provides us with the behavior we are seeking. I can apprehend this man who I am, as he is at this moment in the world. I can see that his attitudes toward being is interrogative. In the very moment in which I ask, is there a mode of behavior that can reveal man's relation with the world? I raise a question. I can consider this question objectively, since it makes little difference whether the questioner is me or the reader who is reading my words, and raising the question alongside me. On the other hand, the question is not merely the objective set of words traced on this page. It is indifferent to the signs that express it. In short, is a human attitude endowed with meaning. It is a human attitude endowed with meaning. What does this attitude reveal? In every question, we confront a being that we interrogate. Every question presupposes, and therefore, a being who questions and a being that is questioned. The question is not the most basic relation between man and being in itself. On the contrary, it stands within the limits of this relation and presupposes it. Moreover, we are questioning the being that we interrogate with respect to something, the thing with respect to which I interrogate being participates in being's transcendence. I interrogate being through its ways of being, or through its being. For this point of view, a question is a type of expectation. I wait for an answer from the interrogated being. In other words, against the ground of my pre-interrogative familiarity with being, I expect this being to disclose its being, or its way of being. The answer will be a yes or a no. They're capitalized. I wonder why. It is the existence of these two equally objective and contradictory possibilities which distinguishes as a matter of principle. a question from an affirmation or a negation. Some questions appear not to admit of a negative answer, such as, for example, the one we raised earlier. What does this attitude reveal? But in fact, we can see that it is always possible to answer this type of question with nobody, nothing, or nobody, or never. In this way, in the moment when I ask, is there a mode of behavior that can reveal man's relation with the world to me? I allow as a matter of principle for the possibility of a negative answer, such as no. No such behavior exists. We accept, therefore, that we may be confronted with the transcendent fact of the non-existence of such a mode of behavior. It might be tempting to refuse to believe in the objective existence of non-being. One could just say that the facts in this case direct me to my subjectivity. I learned from transcendent being that the sought-after behavior is a mere fiction. But in the first place, to call this behavior a mere fiction is to conceal the negation without removing it. Being a mere fiction is equivalent here to being no more than a fiction. Next, if you destroy the reality of the negation, you dissolve the reality of the answer. In fact, it is being itself that gives me this answer, and which therefore discloses the negation to me. Therefore, the permanent and objective possibility of a negative answer does not exist for the questioner. In relation to this possibility, the questioner, by the very fact of asking a question, places himself in a state of non-determination. He doesn't know if the answer will be affirmative or negative. Thus, the question is a bridge thrown between two non-beings. The non-being of... Sorry, I just keep yawning because the book is extremely boring. No, I don't know why. Well, I guess I do know why. I just said it, but like every time I read, I yawn. When I'm playing games, I'm just super engaged. Or shouldn't I be more engaged when I'm reading? Anyway, I don't know, and I'm tearing up a little. Thus, the question is a bridge thrown between two non-beings, the non-being of knowledge in a man, and the possibility of non-being in transcendent being. And finally, the question implies the existence of a truth. There is very question, the questioner affirms that he is waiting for an objective reason. In relation to what we can say, it is like this and not otherwise. In short, truth in its capacity to differentiate being introduces a third non-being as a determinant of the question, the non-being of limitation. So what we have limitation, knowledge in man, and the possibility of a transcendent being, or something like that. This threefold non-being conditions all questioning, and in particular, metaphysical questioning, that is, our questioning. We set off in search of being, and it seems to us that our series of questions had led us into the heart of being, and yet a glance at the activity of questioning itself, just as we were approaching our goal, has suddenly revealed that we are surrounded by nothingness. Our questions about being are conditioned by the permanent possibility of non-being outside us and within us, and non-being, again, circumscribes the answer. What being is necessarily detaches itself against the ground of what it is not. Whatever the answer, it will be able to formulate it like this. Being is that, and apart from that, nothing. In this way, a new component of reality has just appeared to us, non-being. This makes our problem more complicated because we are no longer dealing with the relations between human being and being in itself, but also with being's relation and non-being, and those of human non-being with transcendent non-being. But let us take a closer look. Okay. 2. Negations. The objection will be raised that being in itself cannot supply negative answers. Did we not say ourselves that it lies equally beyond affirmation and negation? Moreover, ordinary experience, reduced to just what it is, does not seem to disclose any non-being. I think there are 1,500 francs in my wallet, and I find only 1,300 francs in it. That does not mean, we might be told, that experience has revealed the non-being of the 1,500 francs, but simply that I counted 13 100-franc notes. Yeah, like what if there was a 200-franc note also in the wallet, but he only counted the 100 francs or something like that. The negation, strictly speaking, should be imputed to me. I might have to look that word up, but it obviously seems like it's implied or like, it's shown. It appears only at the level of my act of judgment, through which I make a comparison between the result I anticipated and the result I obtained. In this way, negation is only a quality of judgment, and what the questioner awaits is a judgment answer. As for nothingness, it can be seen to originate in negative judgments, as a concept that establishes the transcendent unity of all such judgments, a propositional function of the type X is not. We can see where this theory is leading. We are made to observe that being in itself is full positivity and does not contain within itself any negations. In addition, those negative judgments, insofar as they are subjective acts, are wholly assimilated to affirmative judgments, without seeing that Kant, for example, distinguished the internal structure of a negative act of judgment from the structure of an affirmative. In both cases, a synthesis of concepts takes place. Only this synthesis, a full and concrete event, I spit there, within the life of the mind operates in one case by means of the copula is, and in the other by means of the copula is not. Similarly, the manual operations of sorting, separation, and assembling, union, are two modes of behavior that possess the same de facto reality. Thus, negation is said to be at the other end of the act of judgment, yet without thereby being within being. It is like something irreal squeezed between two full realities, neither of which lays claim to it. The being in itself that is interrogated with respect to negation refers us, since it is what it is, to our judgment, and the judgment as something entirely positive and psychological refers us to being, since the negation it formulates concerns being and is, in consequence, transcendent. Negation, incapable of existing by itself, the result of concrete psychological operations, and whose existence is maintained by these very operations, has the mode of existence of a nomadic, correlative. Its esse consisting just in its percipi. The nothingness, as the conceptual unity of negative judgments, cannot have the slightest reality other than conferred by the Stoics on their lekton. Can we accept this outlook? 3. Footnote 3. The lekton in Stoic philosophy is the intelligible content of a thought, The concept roughly corresponds to the concept of a preposition in contemporary philosophy of language. We can put the question in these terms: its negation as the structure of a adjudicative proposition, the origin of nothingness, or, on the contrary, is nothingness. As a structure of reality, the origin and foundation of negations. Thus, the problem of being has directed us to the problem of the question as a human attitude, and the problem of a question directs us to that of a negation's being. Evidently, non-being always appears at the limits of human expectation. It is because I expect to find 1,500 francs that I find only 1,300. It is because the physicist is expecting a particular verification of his hypothesis that nature can say no to him. It would be unproductive, therefore, to deny that negations appear against the basic ground of relation between man and the world. Oh, so it's like something can exist, but it can't be, for something to be right, there has to be a possibility that it can be wrong. Is that really true? It's like, what if you had a rock? Like, it can't be not a rock. It just is a rock. So maybe not. The world does not reveal its non-beings to anyone who has not in the first place posited them as possibilities. But does that mean we should reduce these non-beings to pure subjectivity? I spit again. Ew, this guy fucking spit on his book. Oh, never mind. That was from the other side. Sorry, I should stop pointing out. It's pretty disgusting. I think it's a little funny. Like, you ever like talk to someone and then they just spit on you? And it's like, yeah, they did it by accident. It was just gross. And then you have to pretend like you didn't see it. Or like one time I was talking to my friend and then he like let out a fucking big spit and it fucking went on the fucking table. And I couldn't stop looking at it. But obviously I didn't tell him. And when you're talking to your friend and then they spit and the spit lands on your lip and then you just start tweaking out. Oh my god, get it off! Get it off! Okay, sorry. Sorry, back to reading. And then you just lick it because you're into that kind of stuff. Anyway. Does that mean we should accord them the significance and the type of existence that belongs to the Stoics' lekton or to Husserl's noema? We do not think so. In the first place, it is not true that negation is merely a quality of judgment. A question is formulated by means of an interrogative judgment, but it is not a judgment. It is a prejudicative mode of behavior. I can question something with a look, with a gesture. By questioning that, I take up a specific stance in relation to it, and this relation to being is a relation of being. A judgment is only an optional way of expressing it. Similarly, the questioner does not necessarily have to interrogate a man about being. This conception of the question, by making it into an intersubjective phenomenon, peels it away from the being it adheres to, and leaves it in the air purely as a modality of dialogue. On the contrary, we should conceive of a question within a dialogue as a particular kind within the category of interrogatives, and understand what we are questioning is not first and foremost a thinking being. If my car has broken down, it is the carburetor, the spark plugs, etc. If I interrogate if my watch stops, I can interrogate the watchmaker about the cause of its stopping. But the watchmaker will, in his turn, put his questions to the various mechanisms of the watch. What I expect from the carburetor, what the watchman expects from the cogs of the watch, is not judgment, it is a disclosure of being, on the basis of which one can make a judgment. And if I expect a disclosure of being, it is because I am prepared at the same time for the eventuality of non-being. If I interrogate the carburetor, it is because I consider it possible that there is nothing in the carburetor. Thus my question includes, by its nature, a specific prejudicative understanding of non-being. It is in itself a relation of being with non-being, against the ground of an original transcendence, that is, a relation of being with being. Okay. I low-key don't know what a carburetor is. Like, if my car broke down, I'd be fucked. I would not know what to question. I'd be like, oh, the car's empty. Ha ha ha. It's a philosophy joke that I just learned. Anyway, if, moreover, the distinctive nature of questioning is obscured by the fact that questions are frequently asked by one man to other men, we should note that many non-judicative modes of behavior present and in its original undiluted form. This immediate understanding of non-being against the ground of being. If, for example, we consider destruction, we are obliged to acknowledge that it is an activity that can, of course, make use of judgment as an instrument, but that cannot be defined as being solely or even mainly judicative. Yet it presents the same structure as interrogation. In one sense, of course, man is the only being through whom destruction can be brought about. A geological fold or a storm does not destroy anything. Or at least they do not destroy directly. They merely alter the distribution of mass of beings. After the storm, there is no less than before. There is something else. And even this phrase is inappropriate, because in order to posit the disparity, we need a witness who can, in some way, retain the past and compare it to the present, in the form of a no longer. In the absence of that witness, there is being, both before and after the storm, that is all. And if a cyclone should bring about the death of some particular living beings, this death can only be destruction if it is lived with such. For there to be destruction, there must be first a relation of man to being, that is, transcendence, and within the limits of this relationship, man must apprehend a being as destructible. For that, one must be carved out in its limits within being, and this, as we saw in the case of truth, already involves annihilation. Okay, let me drink some water and look at where the next part would be. It's like 2 more pages. I look-y need to go to the bathroom, but I think I can stick around for 2 more pages and a drink. Sorry, I forgot to mute my mic. Saw in the case of truth already involves annihilation. The being under consideration is that one, and apart from that, nothing. The artilleryman who is assigned to his target takes care to point his cannon in a particular direction, excluding all the others. But that would still mean nothing if he had not been uncovered, if being had not been uncovered as fragile. And what is fragility other than a particular probability of non-being for a given being in some determinate set of circumstances? A being is fragile if it bears within its being a clear-cut possibility of non-being. But again, it is through man that fragility arrives in being. Because of the individuating limitation that we mentioned just now is a condition of fragility. A being is fragile and not all being, which is beyond any possible destruction. Thus the relation of individuating limitations that man maintains with a being against the initial ground of his reason to being brings fragility to this being as the appearance of a permanent possibility of non-being. Does non-being mean death? Like if you get hit by a cannonball, you're just gonna die. But that is not all. In order for there to be destructibility, man must determine himself, either positively or negatively, as he confronts the possibility of non-being. He must take the necessary measures to bring it about, destruction in the strict sense, or through a negation of non-being. To go on maintaining it at the level of a mere possibility, protective measures. Thus, it is man who renders towns destructible, precisely because he posits them as fragile and precious, and because he takes various measures to protect them. It is because this set of measures that an earthquake or a volcanic eruption can destroy these towns or human constructions, and the primary meaning of war and its goal are contained within man's slightest building. We must therefore acknowledge that destruction is an essentially human thing, and that it is man who destroys his town through the intermediary of earthquakes, or directly, and it is man who destroys his boats through the intermediary of cyclones, or directly. But at the same time, we must allow that destruction presupposes a prejudicative understanding of nothingness as such, and a mode of behavior in the face of man. It is an objective fact and not a thought. Fragility has impressed itself right into the being of this face, and its destruction would be an irreversible and absolute event that I could only observe. There is a trans phenomenality of non-being as a being. Our examination of this behavior of destruction leads us therefore to the same results as our examination of questioning. But if we want to decide for certain, we need only consider a negative judgment in itself, and ask whether it makes non-being appear within being, or whether it confines itself to establishing some prior discovery. I am meeting Pierre at 4 o'clock. I arrive a quarter of an hour late. Pierre is always punctual. Will he have waited for me? I look at the customers and I say he is not here. Is there an intuition of Pierre's absence, or does negation only intervene alongside judgment? At first sight, it seems absurd to talk here of intuition. Hold on. Seems absurd to talk here of intuition, just because there cannot be an intuition of nothing, and Pierre's absence is this nothing. Yet popular consciousness bears witness to this intuition. Do we not say, for example, I saw right away that he was not there? In this case, is the negation simply displaced? Let us take a closer look. Certainly, the cafe by itself, with its customers, its table, its seats, its mirrors, its light, the smoke-filled atmosphere, the sounds that fill it, of voices, saucers bumping against each other, footsteps, is a fullness of being. All the particular intuitions I may have are fulfilled by these smells, these sounds, these colors, all of them phenomena that have a trans-phenomenal being. Similarly, Pierre's current presence in a place I do not know is also a plenitude of being. We seem to have found plenitude everywhere, but we must observe that in perception a figure is always constituted against a ground. For the figure-ground opposition, see my Gestalt psychology on notes in the translation. No object or group of objects is particularly earmarked to organize itself as either ground or figure. It all depends on the direction of my attention. When I enter the cafe to look for Pierre, a synthetic organization of all the objects in the cafe is formed against which Pierre is given as having to appear. At this first organization of the cafe as a ground is a first annihilation. Each element in the room, person, table, chair, tries to separate itself, to detach itself against the ground, constituted by the totality of the other objects, and then collapses back into that undifferentiated ground and is diluted within it. Because the ground is something we can only see in addition, it is the object of a purely marginal attention. So this first annihilation of all the figures which appear and are swallowed up within the total equivalence of a ground. It is the necessary condition for the appearance of the principal figure in case the person, Pierre, and this annihilation is given to my intuition. I am the witness of the successive dissolution of every object that I look at, especially the faces which detain me for a moment. Could this be Pierre? And immediately disperse, precisely because they are not Pierre's face. If, however, I were to at last encounter Pierre, my intuition would be fulfilled by a solid element. All at once I would become fascinated by his face, and the whole cafe, in its inconspicuous presence, would organize itself around him. But in fact, Pierre is not there. That does not mean that I discover his absence in some precise part of the building. In fact, Pierre is absent from the whole cafe. His absence freezes the cafe in its evanescence. I don't know that word. Okay, can I have a quick looking stuff up break? Evanescence. Meaning. When you look it up, it just shows you the band. The quality of vanishing and fading away, to disappear or vanish. Okay, and also can I fucking scroll on Reddit for a little bit? I mean, to be honest, now is not the time to be on Reddit. Okay. Yeah, you're right. I can take a break soon. I've really been streaming for 3 hours already. Damn. Okay, anyway, we're talking about Pierre and being fascinated by him. Yay. The cafe remains as ground. It continues to present itself to my merely marginal attention as an undifferentiated totality. It slides away in pursuit of its annihilation. Only it makes itself the ground for a specific figure. It bears it everywhere in front of it. It presents me with it everywhere, and this figure, sliding constantly between my gaze and the real, solid objects of the cafe, is precisely a perpetual dissolution. It is Pierre, detaching himself as nothingness against the ground of the annihilation of the cafe. What is given to intuition? Hold on, I'm lost already. What is given to intuition is a flickering of nothingness. It is the nothingness of the ground, whose annihilation calls for and requires the appearance of the figure, and is also the figure, a nothingness that slides in the guise of nothing, across the surface of the ground. Therefore, the foundation for the judgment Pierre is not here is clearly my intuitive apprehension of a double annihilation. And of course, Pierre's absence presupposes an initial relation between me and this cafe. There are an infinite number of people without any relation to this cafe, for want of any genuine expectation that might register their absence. But precisely I was expecting to see Pierre, and my expectation has made Pierre's absence happen as a real event concerning this cafe. Now his absence is an objective fact I have discovered, and it presents itself as a synthetic relation between Pierre and the room which I am in looking for him. Pierre, absent, haunts this cafe, and is the condition of its annihilating organization as a ground. In contrast, the judgments that I might amuse myself by making next, such as Wellington is not in this cafe, Paul Valéry isn't here either, are purely abstract meanings, mere applications of the principle of negation, without any real bias or efficacy. And we do not succeed in establishing any real relationship between the cafe, Wellington, or Valerie. Here, the relation is merely a thought. That suffices to show that non-being does not come to things by means of a negative judgment. On the contrary, it is the negative judgment that is conditioned and supported by non-being. How, moreover, could it be otherwise? How could we even conceive of a negative form of judgment if everything was a plenitude of being and possibility? We thought for a moment that negation might arise from the comparison established between a anticipated result and the result obtained. But let us look at this comparison. Here is the first judgment, a concrete and positive mental act, recording a fact. There are 1,300 francs in my wallet, and here is another. And this one only records a fact and an affirmation. I was expecting to find 1,500 francs. Here are some real and objective facts, positive mental events, affirmative judgments. Where is there any space for negation? Should we believe that it is nothing but pure and simple application of a category? And ought we to say that the mind possesses the not within it as a form of sorting and separation? But in that case, we would not be removing the slightest suspicion of negativity from negation. If we allow that the category not, a category that exists in fact of the mind, as a positive, concrete procedure for handling and systematizing our knowledge, is suddenly activated by the presence of certain affirmative judgments from us, and suddenly stamps with its seal certain thoughts that result from these judgments, we will, by means of these considerations, have scrupulously stripped negation of any negative function. Because negation is a refusal of existence by its means, a being or way of beings is posited and then expelled into nothingness. If negation is a category, it would only stamp indifferently placed on various, it is only a stamp indifferently placed on various judgments. Where do we get the sense that it can annihilate a being, that can suddenly make something arise and give it a name in order to expel it into non-being? If our previous judgments, like we have used in example, are records of facts, then negation must be like a free invention. It must separate us from this wall of possibility enclosing us. Negation must be an abrupt break in continuity, an original and irreducible event that cannot in any circumstance result from any earlier affirmations. But here we are in the sphere of consciousness, and consciousness cannot produce a negation, except in those forms of consciousness of negation. No category can inhabit consciousness and reside there in the matter of thing. The not, as a sudden intuitive discovery, appears as the consciousness of being, conscious to the not. In brief, if there is being everywhere, there is nothingness, as Bergson would have it, becomes inconceivable. Footnote 5. Bergson gives his reductive arguments against the idea of non-being, opposed from Sartre and Bergson, something 1911. Oh. From being, we can never derive negation. The necessary condition for the possibility of saying not is that non-being should be constantly present, within us and outside us, that nothingness should haunt being. But where does nothingness come from? It is, and if it is the most basic condition of questioning, behavior, and more generally of all philosophical or scientific investigations. What is the basic relation between human beings and nothingness? What is the most basic annihilating behavior? Okay, and now how long is this section? It's like from 50 to 45, so it's 5 pages long. Anyway, I have to use the bathroom. So I will be right back. And you know what, honestly, I'm gonna take hello, the break's over, so yeah, let's go back. No, I should have said that on camera, but I ate a sandwich with capicolo in it, or cured ham, and I pretend I was Tony from The Sopranos, and then I ate some chips. There's like a snack mix of pretzels, Cheetos, Sun Chips, and Doritos. I had some of that. I had 2 bananas, and I ate a custard bun that my mom made. It's pretty good. Okay, well, now with all that out of the way, let's get back to reading. Maybe I should take a break to digest the food. No, it's fine. Number 3, the dialectical conception of nothingness. It is still too soon for us to be able to extract the meaning of this nothingness, with which the activity of questioning has suddenly confronted us. Hold on, I have to burp. Okay. But we are now able to provide a number of clarifications. In particular, it would be no bad thing to determine the relationship between being and the non-being that haunts it. Indeed, we noticed a degree of parallelism between human ways of behaving in relation to being and man's behavior in the face of nothingness. And this tempts us immediately to regard being and non-being as two complementary constituents of reality. Like shallow and light, if we do that, we find ourselves dealing with two wholly contemporary notions, able in some way to come together in the production of existence, and which it would be fruitless to consider in isolation. Pure being and pure non-being would be two abstractions, whose combination alone would form the base of concrete realities. That is Hegel's point of view. Indeed, he studies the relations of being and non-being in his logic, and he calls this logic the system of pure thought determinations. 6, and he clarifies his definition. 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 6, 7. Okay, let's go back here and read the translator notes. 6 here. And in the following sentence, I use the published English translation of the French excerpt from Hegel. Both are from Hegel, 1991, number 24. Sartre's note, Introduction to the Lesser Logic, XXIV. I think that's 24. Page 24, cited by Lefebvre, Morceau Choisy. Translator note, in the Lefebvre anthology is available in French as Hegel, 1995. Okay. And he clarifies his definition. In the case of thought in the ordinary sense, we always represent to ourselves something that is not merely pure thought, for we intend by it something that is thought of, but which has an empirical content. In the logic, thoughts are grasped in such a way that they have no content other than the one that belongs to thinking itself and is brought forth by thinking. Of course, there are determinations. These determinations are what is most inward in things, but at the same time, when we consider them in and for themselves, we deduce them from thoughts itself and we discover in them their truth. However, Hegel's logic aims to make evident the incompleteness of the notions that it considers one by one, and the necessity, if we are to understand them, of rising to a more complete notion, which, in integrating them, sublates them. 8. Footnote 8. Sartre's note Laporte in The Problem of Abstraction, the book by Laporte on which Sartre draws here, has not been translated into English. Okay. Lesen's remark about Hamlin's philosophy can be applied to Hegel. Each of the lower terms depends on the higher term, as the abstract depends on the concrete that is necessary for its actualization. 9. Sartre also takes this sentence from the Laporte text just cited on page 24. The French philosopher René Lessen was a professor at the Sorbonne. Lessen was influenced by the dialectical idealism of an earlier French philosopher, Octave Hamelin, also mentioned in this sentence. The truly concrete for Hegel is the existent within its essence. It is the totality produced by the synthetic integration of all the abstract moments which, in demanding their complement, are sublated within it. In this sense, being is an abstraction, the most abstract and impoverished. If we regard it in itself, that is, by severing it from its sublation toward essence, indeed, being stands in relation to essence as the immediate to the mediate. Things simply are, but their being consists in this, that they manifest their essence. Being goes over into essence. One can express it thus. Being presupposes essence, but although essence, in comparison with being, appears as that which is mediated, yet, notwithstanding, essence is the true origin. In essence, being returns into its ground. Being sublates itself in essence. Okay, and then there's a big note over here. Hold on. Sartre's note. Esquisse de la Logique, written by Hegel between 1808 and 1811, was the basis for his lessons in the Nuremberg Gymnasium, not to be mistaken with the Nuremberg trials, I think. Translator notes Sartre found the text mentioned in this note in the Lefebvre anthology. The text was not published during Hegel's lifetime, but is now available in English translation as Logic for the Middle Class. In Hegel, 1986, I've used that translation. The passage Sartre quotes is on page 76. Man, I don't like how, well, I guess don't like is a pretty strong word, but it's like, you have to go look at the rest of the books. Like, once you know one thing, you have to go know everything. And, since knowledge obviously stacks on itself, how they say we're riding on the shoulders of giants, this basically means I have to go look at all the other talking philosophers ever made, in order to actually get a good grasp on the world or reality. I guess it depends on what kind of philosophy I want to study, but I don't know. This is supposed to be on existentialism, right? So it's how do we know our actions are our own, or how is it on fate and all that? That's kind of what I want to get to. But honestly, this guy's low-key. This guy is literally talking about nothing. Nihility, essence, and being. But anyway, hold on. And now I gotta take off my fucking... get rid of my robe because it's too hot now. No, hopefully you can't see my reflection in the whatever. You low-key can, but you know what? Whatever. You might have been able to see me for a second. In this way, being cut off from the essence is its foundation, becomes mere empty immediacy, and that is just how the phenomenology of spirit defines it. which presents pure being from the point of view of the truth as the immediate. If the beginning of logic must be immediate, we will be able to find our beginnings in being as the first beginning, which cannot be anything mediated and further determined. Footnote 11. I've quoted the corresponding English page from Hegel. Okay. But being thus determined at once passes over into its opposite. But this pure being, Hegel writes in the Lesser Logic, is pure abstraction, and hence it is the absolutely negative, which when taken immediately is equally nothing. Footnote 12. I translated the corresponding English passage from Hegel. Indeed, isn't nothingness simple self-identity, complete emptiness, the absence of any determinations or content? Therefore, pure being and pure nothingness are the same thing, or rather, it is correct to say that they differ. But because the distinction has not yet determined itself, precisely because being and nothing are the immediate, it is as belonging to them what cannot be said, what is merely meant. Yeah, that's confusing. Sartre's note, Hegel Petite Logique, I translated, or I quote the English passage. Okay. In other words, as expressed in concrete terms, nowhere on heaven or earth is there anything which does not contain both being and nothing in itself. Once again, I quote the corresponding English passage from Hegel on footnote 14. It is still too soon to discuss Hegel's conception as it is, when we have all the rules of our investigation. We will be able to take up a position in relation to it. We should simply point out that Hegel reduces to being to a meaning of the existent. Being is surrounded by its existent, which is its foundation and origin. Hegel's whole theory is based on the idea that a philosophical process is needed in order to reach, at the beginning of his logic, the immediate from the mediated, and the abstract from the concrete which founds it. But we have already pointed out that being, in relation to the phenomenon, is not like the abstract in relation to the concrete. Being is not one structure among others, a moment of the object. Is the very condition. Hold on, what am I feeling here? Oh shit, there's a rip in the book. It's because it fell. I dropped it. Oh man. Okay. Hegel's whole theory is based on the idea that a philosophical process is needed in order to reach, at the beginning of his logic, the immediate from the mediated, and the abstract from the concrete which founds it. But we have already pointed out that being in relation to the phenomenon is not like the abstract in relation to the concrete. Being is not one structure among others, a moment of the object. It is the very condition of all structures and all moments. It is the foundation on which the characteristics of the phenomenon will be made manifest. And similarly, we cannot allow that the being of things consists in manifesting their essence. 15. Sartre found this in the Lefebvre anthology. It comes from the Esquisse de la Logique, the correspondent English translation, slightly modified is a Hegel. Let me drink something. Oh. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear my mouth noises. That'll be pretty disgusting. I hope not. I shouldn't be picking up on the microphone. If that were the case, there would need to be a being of that being. If, moreover, the being of things were to consist in their manifesting, it is difficult to see how Hegel could establish a pure moment of being in which not even a trace of this initial structure can be found. It is true that pure being is fixed by the understanding, isolated by it, and frozen in its actual determinations. But if its sublation toward essence constitute being's main characteristics, and if the understanding only determines and holds the determination fixed. 16. I quote the corresponding English passage from Hegel. It is difficult to see why it does not determine being precisely as consisting in manifesting. It might be said that for Hegel, all determination is negation. But on this view, the understanding limits itself to denying in relation to its object that it is other than it is. That is probably enough to prevent any dialectical process. But it will not be enough to make sublation disappear, to uproot it entirely, insofar as being sublates into something else. It escapes the determination of the understanding, but insofar as it sublates itself, that is, insofar as it is in the depths of its being, the origin of its own sublation, it must on the contrary appear as it is to the understanding that freezes in its own determinations. To affirm that being is only what it is would at the very least leave being intact insofar as it is its sublation. Thus to the ambiguity of Hegel's notion of sublation, which sometimes seems to be a surge from the depths of the being in view, and at other times an extreme movement that carries it away. It is not enough to claim that the understanding finds in a being only what it is. It still needs to be explained how that being, which is what it is, can be no more than that, to be legitimate, such an explanation would need to consider the phenomenon of being as such, not the understanding's process of negation. Okay, hold on, I need to Google some words. Sublation, probably. I guess insofar. And is that it? What other words do I need to look up? Yeah. Okay, I do some Googling then. Hold on. Oh. Insofar to the extent that, and then sublation. In Hegelian philosophy, where tension between contradictory opposites is resolved by the addition of a new term that pushes the old opposition to its relation. I don't really know what that means. Synonym. It's like a synonym. No, a synonym is Offenberg. Okay, anyway. Hold on. Yeah, hold on. I gotta do some stuff. And by some stuff, I mean I just gotta fucking play NGU idle. Okay, let's go back. And being a VTuber must be pretty scary. Like if those scissors and I was a VTuber, like what if you could see the reflection in my face and then dox me? Ah, scary. Understandings, processes of negation. But what we need to examine here is Hegel's claim that being and nothingness constitute two contraries whose difference at the level of abstraction under consideration is merely meant. To oppose being to nothingness as thesis to antithesis, as Hegel's understanding does, is to suppose them to be logically contemporaneous, contemporaneous, I don't know, contemporaneous, probably. In this way, the two contraries arise at the same time, like the two limiting terms of a logical series. But we must take care here to note that the contraries can enjoy this simultaneity only because they are equally positive or equally negative. However, non-being is not the contrary of being, but its contradictory. That implies that nothingness is logically subsequent to being, since being is posited first and then negated. Being and non-being cannot therefore be concepts with the same content because, on the contrary, non-being requires an irreducible intellectual process, notwithstanding being's primitive lack of differentiation. Non-being is the same lack of differentiation negated. What enables Hegel to make being pass over into nothingness is his implicitly introducing negation into his very definition of being. Uh, is his implicitly introducing negation into his very definition of being. This goes without saying, since the definition is negative, and since Hegel has told us, by taking up an expression from Spinoza, that omnis determinatio est negatio. 17. What does that mean? The Latin phrase means every determination is negation. In fact, this phrase does not appear in Spinoza's published writing, but in a 1674 letter to Gerigels. Arguably, the doctrine is implicit in Spinoza's ethics. And doesn't he say, if any content were posited in being as distinct, or if it were posited by this determination or content as distinct from an other, it would therefore fail to hold fast to its purity. It is pure indeterminateness and emptiness. There is nothing to be intuited in it. In it? Question mark? I don't even know what this guy's saying. Oh, I think this whole part is like a passage, maybe. 18. Sartre is quoting from Hegel's Science of Logic. I quote the corresponding English passage from Hegel. Okay. And if he doesn't say, if any... Hold on. So he is the one who introduces this negation into being from outside, which he then rediscovers when he makes being pass over into non-being. But here there is a play on words in relation to the very notion of negation. Because if I negate, with respect to being, every determination and every content, I can only do that while affirming that at least one being is. Thus, one can negate with respect to being as much as one likes, but one cannot make it not be, by virtue of the very fact that one is negating its being this or that. Where being is absolute plenitude and entire positivity, negation cannot reach to being's core. However, non-being is a negation that aims at the core of plenary density itself. Non-being negates itself in its heart. When Hegel writes, being and nothing, Hegel writes in the 19 Petite Logique, I quote the corresponding English passage from Hegel. Being and nothing are empty abstractions, and each of them is as empty as the other. He forgets that any void or emptiness must be empty of something. 20. Sartre's note, what makes this even stranger is that Hegel is the first to have noticed that every negation is a determinate negation, or in other words, that it bears on a content. Now, being is empty of any determination other than its identity with itself, but non-being is empty of being. In brief, and against Hegel, what we need to remember is that being is and that nothingness is not. Is and not. But we need to remember, thus, even if being did not support any differentiated quality, nothingness would be logically subsequent to it, since it presupposes being in order to negate it, since the irreducible quality of not is superadded to the undifferentiated mass of being in order to deliver it. That does not only mean that we should refuse to place being and non-being on the same level, but in addition that we should take care to never posit nothingness as a primordial abyss out of which nothing comes. Our use of the notion of nothingness in its everyday guise is always presupposes some preliminary specification of being. It is striking. In this respect, the language provides us with a nothingness of things, nothing and a nothingness of human beings, nobody. But in the majority of cases, the specifications is still taken further. We say, referring to a particular collection of objects, none of them is to be touched, which is to say very precisely nothing in this collection. Similarly, someone who's questioned about some quite specific events in private or public life may reply, I know nothing about it, and this nothing comprises the set of facts about which he was questioned. 21. Footnote 21. Sartre's example of everyday locutions here cannot be translated in a way that both preserves Sartre's point and uses everyday English. I've slightly altered the examples where necessary in order to preserve Sartre's intended emphasis on the multiplicity of instances in which we talk about nothing. Even Socrates, with his famous phrase, I know that I know nothing, 22. While this famous phrase is widely attributed to Plato's Socrates, it does not actually occur verbatim anywhere in Plato's works. Oh. Means that everyone who used it, you know. Now hold on. Oh yeah, look, I got banned this guy. Okay, there we go. Refers precisely by this nothing to the totality of being. Oh, it was a bot, by the way. I was a person, obviously. Probably viewed in truth, if adopting for a moment the viewpoint of simple-minded cosmogonies. Hold on. We tried to ask what there was before the world existed and replied nothing. We would have to recognize that both these terms before and nothing work retrospectively. What we lodge within being are denying today is that there was any being before this being. The negation here emanates from a consciousness that turns back towards its origins. If we removed from the original void its property of being empty in this world, and of any structure that had taken on the form of a world, along with its property of before, which presupposes an after in relation to which I constitute it as before, the negation itself would vanish, making way for a total absence of determination that would be impossible to conceive, not even and especially not in terms of nothingness. In this way, we can say, inverting Spinoza's formula, that all negation is determination. Therefore, being is antecedent to nothingness and founds it. We must interpret this as meaning not only that being has logical priority over nothingness, but also that, in concrete terms, it is from being that nothingness derives its efficacy. We express this by saying that nothingness haunts being. In other words, being can be conceived of without any need of nothingness, and we can exhaustively explore the notion of being without finding in it the slightest trace of nothingness. On the contrary, the nothingness that is not can only have a borrowed existence. It takes its being from being. We can encounter its nothingness of being only within the limits of being, and being's total disappearance would not mean the ascension of a reign of non-being, while on the contrary, the concomitant disappearance of nothingness, there's non-being only on the surface of being. Okay, I gotta look up two words. Concomitant and cosmogonies. And hold on, I also gotta use a bathroom. But I'll tell you. Okay. Maybe it's cosmogonies and concomitant. Concomitant. Naturally accompanying or associating, and cosmogony is the science of branches that has something to do with the universe. And also I gotta use a bathroom. Oh yeah, the bathroom. Okay. Oh shit. Hello. How long has that thing been paused? Oh my god. I paused like... Oh my god. Fuck. Okay, luckily I caught that. I basically... Ah, fuck me. So what I basically did, I paused it by accident. I paused the fucking video by accident. And now I paused the video by accident and I already read like 2 pages. But luckily it's only 2 pages. So here, how about this? I'll just let you, like, you can just look here and then I'll pause the video because I'm recording a YouTube video. Okay, never mind. I'm explaining to my stream, but there's nobody fucking here, so who fucking cares? Who freaking cares? Anyway, now look here. Now read this part and, pause the video to read it. And now you can look at the footnotes here. Pause the video to read it. I can't get everything. And then I read up to like here. So read this page, pause the video, and check out the footnotes. And then here, pause the video and, check this part out. But I mean, I'm right here. Like, I got to right here, so I'm just gonna keep reading now. It is at the origin of negative judgment because it is itself negation. It can found negation as an act because it is negation as being. Okay, anyway, that was a really close one. I could have like read a whole hour and like got to nowhere. Ooh. Nothingness cannot be nothingness without annihilating itself explicitly as the nothingness of the world. In other words, it must explicitly direct itself in its annihilation toward the world in order to constitute itself as the refusal of the world. Nothingness bears being. Hold on, I'm getting like confused on the fucking pages. Nothing bears being in its heart, but how does the emergent being take account of this annihilating refusal? Transcendence as a project of itself beyond cannot found nothingness at all. On the contrary, it is nothingness that at the very heart of transcendence and conditions it. Now, Heidegger's philosophy is characterized by his use of positive terms for Dasein, or for Dasein, all of which disguise implicit negations. Dasein is outside itself, in the world, a being of distances, care, its own possibilities, etc. This all amounts to saying that Dasein is not in itself. Dasein is not in itself. It is not in immediate proximity to itself, and that it surpasses the world insofar as it posits itself as not being in itself and not being the world. In the sense, Hegel is in the right against Heidegger when he asserts that spirit is the negative. Part 30. C'est Hegel qui déclare que l'esprit est le négatif. Hegel says that spirit is the negative in the preface to the first edition of The Science of Logic, 2010. Only then can we put the same question to each of them in almost the same form. To Hegel, we must say, is it not enough to posit spirit as medication and the negative? You need to show how the negative is the structure of spirit's being. What must spirit be in order to constitute itself as the negative? And we can ask Heidegger if negation is simply the primary structure of transcendence. What must the primary structure of human reality be in order for it to transcend the world? In both cases, we are showing a negating activity without any concern to found this activity on a negative being. And furthermore, Heidegger makes nothingness a sort of intentional correlate of transcendence, without seeing that he has already inserted it within transcendence itself as its primordial structure. But in addition, what is the point of claiming that nothingness founds negation if what follows is a theory of non-being that ex hypothesi severs nothingness from any actual negation? If I emerge out of nothingness beyond the world, how can this extra-worldly nothingness found those little lakes of non-being that we encounter at each instant without being? I say that Pierre is not there, that I have no more money, etc. Is it really necessary, in order to found these everyday judgments, to surpass the world towards nothingness and then come right back to being? And how is this operation brought about? Not by making the world slide into nothingness, but rather while remaining within the limits of being, by simply withholding an attribute from its subject. But it might not be said that each withheld attribute, each negated being, is caught up within a single identity, extra-worldly nothingness. That non-being is like the totality of what is not, and that the world is suspended within non-being, like the real within the possibilities. In that case, one would have to make each negation originate in a specific act of surpassing, the surpassing of being toward the other. But how can the surpassing be anything but, quite simply, Hegel's mediation? And haven't we already asked Hegel in vain for the annihilating foundations of meditation? And besides, even if the explanation worked for these simple radical negations that deny of some particular object any sort of presence within being, the centaur does not exist. There is no reason for him to be late. The ancient Greeks did not practice polygamy. Are you sure? I think they did practice polygamy. Negations that might at a stretch contribute to the constitution of nothingness as a kind of geometric place of all failed projects. Oh my god. Sorry. Kind of geometric place of all failed projects of inaccurate representations. All beings that have disappeared or whose ideas made up this interpretation of non-being would not work for a certain type of real particulars, to tell the truth. In certain type de realities, Sartre's plural form, literally reality, sounds odd in English. For clarity, I've inserted the word particulars. Sartre is referring here to the negativities. Okay. The negativities. Okay. The most common that include non-being in their being. How could we accept that part of them lies within the universe while a wholly other part lies outside it in extra-worldly nothingness? Take, for example, the notion of distance, which conditions the determination of a place or the localization of a point. It is easy to see that it contains a negative moment. 2 points are distant when a specific language separates them. In other words, the length, a positive attribute of some segment of a line, enters in here as the negation of an absolute, undifferentiated proximity. Some might wish to reduce distance to being no more than the length of the segment of which the 2 points in question A and B are the limits. But surely they ought to see that in this case we have switched the direction of our attention, and that under cover of the same word a different object has been given to intuition. The organized complex constituted by the segment with its 2 limiting terms can, in effect, deliver 2 different objects of knowledge. We can present the segment to ourselves as the immediate object of intuition. In that case, the segment will represent a full concrete tension whose length is a positive attribute and whose 2 points A and B appear only in the moment in the structure as a whole, that is, only insofar as the segment itself implies them as its limits. In that case, negation, expelled from the segment and its length, will take refuge in the 2 limits. To say that point B is the segment's limit amounts to saying that the segment does not extend beyond that point. However, the negation is the secondary structure of the object. On the contrary, if we direct our attention to the 2 points A and B, they show up as immediate objects. Sorry, I got lost. Oh my god. The negation of a secondary, on the contrary, intuition is grasped on the basics of the 2 points as the void, the negative that separates them. The negation escapes from the points which cease to be limits to impregnate the actual length of the segment. Whoa, pause. And the capacity of distance. Thus the total figure constituted by the segment and its 2 terms with a negation that is internal to its structure allows us to apprehend it in two ways. Or rather, there are two figures, and the condition of one of them appearing is the disintegration of the other. Just as in perception, we can constitute one object as the figure by repelling some other object to the point where it becomes the ground and vice versa. In each case, we find the same amount of negation, which at one moment is contained within the notion of the limits and at the next moment within the notion of distance, but which cannot be eliminated. Might it be said that the idea of distance is psychological and that it simply refers to the expanse that we have to cross in order to go from point A to point B? We will reply that crossing includes the same negation, since that notion expresses exactly the passive resistance of remoteness. We are happy to concede with Heidegger that human reality is de-distancing, that is, it arises in the world as the being that creates distance and at the same time makes them dissolved. Entfernend, or entfernend, 32. The French adjective désillusionant is a neologism used to translate Heidegger's complicated term entfernend. Here I follow John Stambach's practice in her translation of Being and Time, Heidegger 2010, and use de-distancing. De-distancing, i.e., it arises in the world that creates distances at the same time makes them dissolved. But this de-distancing, even if it is necessary condition for there to be distance in general, contains distance within itself as the negative structure to be overcome. 33. Pour Quillier, the quotation mark signal that Sartre has in mind, Heidegger's phrase, escaped, for which the French il y a is a good equivalent. See my note on Heidegger vocabulary on notes of the translation. Okay. We can try in vain to reduce distance to the simple result of a measurement. What we have seen in the course of the preceding description is that the 2 points and the segment included between them have the indissoluble unity of what the Germans call a Gestalt. Negation is the cement that brings this unity about. It defines precisely the immediate relationship connecting these 2 points, which presents them to intuition as the indissoluble unit of distance. If you claim the distance is reducible to the measurement of a length, you would only cover up this negation because the negation is the measurement's raison d'etre. What we have just shown by examining distance might just as well have been pointed out by describing realities such as absence, alteration, alternity, repulsion, regret, absent-mindedness, etc. There is an infinite number of realities that are not only objects of judgment, but which are experienced, fought against, feared, etc. by human beings, and which are inhabited by their internal structure by negation as a necessary condition of their existence. We call them negativities. 34. The term negatity is Sartre's neologism. See my notes on the translation. Kant glimpsed their importance when he talked about limitative concepts, the immortality of the soul, a sort of synthesis between the negative and the positive, in which negation is a condition of positivity. The negation's function varies according to the nature of the object in question. Beyond the fully positive realities, which nonetheless retain negation as the condition of their sharpness, of the sharpness of their contours, as that which fixes them as what they are, and those whose positivity is only an appearance concealing a hull of nothingness, all intermediaries are possible. In any case, it becomes impossible to hurl these negations back into some extra-worldly nothingness, as they are conditions of reality, dispersed throughout being and supported by being. Extra-worldly nothingness can account for absolute negation, but we have just discovered a proliferation of intra-worldly beings that possess as much reality and efficacy as other beings, but which enclose non-being within themselves. The explanation they require must remain within the limits of the real. Nothingness, if it is only supported by being, vanishes as nothingness, and we fall back into being. Nothingness can only annihilate itself on the ground of being. If nothingness can be given, it is neither before being nor after being, nor is it in a general way outside. Rather, it is right inside being, in its heart, like a worm. Wow, like a worm. Yeah, I have no idea what's going on anymore, but whatever. 5, the origin of nothingness. And honestly, let me just see how many pages to get to the second part. It's like, do I really want these to be like 2 hours per video? Yeah, it's probably good for me. Did I miss it? This is a lot of pages. Please tell me it ends. The origin of negation. Nope. I have to read this whole thing. This is 20 pages long, is it? Am I tripping here? 57 to like 85. 57 to like 86, which is 30 pages. Fuck it. Yeah, we will not be doing that today. I'm not gonna lie. Okay. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like philosophy, make sure to like and subscribe and do all that good stuff, because I don't know, because I told you to. But like, if I were to summarize what I just read, I don't even know what I read. It's like there's being and there's nothingness, and like you can't have both. Or you can have both because they are like basically one and the same, and you can't have one without the other. Kind of. And it's like reality. It's like somewhere in the middle. Holy shit, man. Like, I can't believe this guy was born like over a century ago and like he just knew that shit. Like, how are you like how is he just so smart? I don't know. Like, I'm kind of fucking mad. It's like I know he was like old when he made it, but it's like, it's like when people are that old, they're like, well, I don't know how old he was, maybe like 40. That's like when people are that old, they just don't know shit. But this guy was like the smartest guy ever. Well, he wasn't the smartest guy ever, okay? Let's not glaze him too bad. But like, damn, it's like crazy how some people can just be so intelligent and then some people are so fucking stupid, like me. Anyway, that's pretty depressing, but that's the end of the video. I guess let me know what you think in the fucking comments below or whatever YouTubers say. Okay, thanks for watching. Goodbye.